Hello, how are you? I'm Kim Dodsworth. The great 17th century French philosopher Voltaire had a keen eye for the foibles and fallibilities of humankind. This is his story about Memnon, a resident of ancient Nineveh who thought he had discovered the key to human wisdom. Memnon one day took it into his head to become a great philosopher. There are few men who have not at some time or another conceived the same wild project. Says Memnon to himself, "To be a perfect philosopher, and of course to be perfectly happy, I have nothing to do but to divest myself entirely of passions. And nothing is more easy, as everybody knows. In the first place, I will never be in love, for when I see a beautiful woman, I will say to myself, these cheeks will one day grow wrinkled, these eyes be encircled with vermilion, that bosom become flabby and pendant, that head bald and palsied. Now I have only to consider her at present in imagination as she will afterwards appear, and certainly a fair face will never turn my head. In the second place, I will always be temperate. It will be in vain to tempt me with good cheer, with delicious wines, or the charms of society. I will have only to figure to myself the consequences of excess, an aching head, a loathing stomach, the loss of reason, of health, and of time. I will then only eat to supply the waste of nature. My health will always be equal, my ideas pure and luminous. All this is so easy that there is no merit in accomplishing it. But, says Memnon, I must think a little of how I am to regulate my fortune. Why, my desires are moderate, my wealth is securely placed with the Receiver General of the finances of Nineveh. I have wherewithal to live independently, and that is the greatest of blessings. I shall never be under the cruel necessity of dancing attendance at court. I will never envy anyone, and nobody will envy me. Still, all this is easy. I have friends, and I will preserve them, for we shall never have any difference. I will never take amiss anything they may say or do, and they will behave in the same way to me. There is no difficulty in all this." Having thus laid his little plan of philosophy in his closet, Memnon put his head out of the window. He saw two women walking under the plane trees near his house. The one was old and appeared quite at her ease. The other was young, handsome, and seemingly much agitated. She sighed, she wept, and seemed on that account still more beautiful. Our philosopher was touched, not to be sure with the beauty of the lady, he was too much determined not to feel any uneasiness of that kind, but with the distress which he saw her in. He came downstairs and accosted the young Ninevite in the design of consoling her with philosophy. That lovely person related to him with an air of great simplicity and in the most affecting manner the injury she sustained from an imaginary uncle, with what art he had deprived her of some imaginary property, and of the violence which she pretended to dread from him. "You appear to me," said she, "a man of such wisdom that if you will condescend to come to my house and examine into my affairs, I am persuaded you will be able to draw me from the cruel embarrassment I am at present involved in." Memnon did not hesitate to follow her, to examine her affairs philosophically, and to give her sound counsel. The afflicted lady led him into a perfumed chamber, and politely made him sit down with her on a large sofa, where they both placed themselves opposite to each other in the attitude of conversation, their legs crossed, the one eager in telling her story, the other listening with devout attention. The lady spoke with downcast eyes, whence there sometimes fell a tear, and which, as she now and then ventured to raise them, always met those of the sage Memnon. Their discourse was full of tenderness, which redoubled as often as their eyes met. Memnon took her affairs exceedingly to heart. and felt himself every instant more and more inclined to oblige a person so virtuous and so unhappy. By degrees, in the warmth of conversation, they ceased to sit opposite. They drew nearer. Their legs were no longer crossed. Memnon counselled her so closely and gave her such tender advices that neither of them could talk any longer of business, nor well knew what they were about. At this interesting moment, as may easily be imagined, who should come in but the uncle? He was armed from head to foot, and the first thing he said was that he would immediately sacrifice, as was just, the sage Memnon and his niece. The latter, who made her escape, knew that he was well enough disposed to pardon, provided a good round sum was offered to him. Memnon was obliged to purchase his safety with all he had about him. In those days, people were happy in getting so easily quit. America was not then discovered, and distressed ladies were not nearly as dangerous as they are now. Memnon, covered with shame and confusion, got home to his own house. There he found a card inviting him to dinner with some of his intimate friends. "If I remain at home alone," said he, "I shall have my mind so occupied with this vexatious adventure that I shall not be able to eat a bit, and I shall bring upon myself some disease. It will therefore be prudent in me to go to my intimate friends, and partake with them of a frugal repast. I shall forget in the sweets of their society that folly I have this morning been guilty of." Accordingly, he attends the meeting. He is discovered to be uneasy at something, and is urged to drink and banish care. A little wine, drunk in moderation, comforts the heart of God and man, so reasons Memnon the philosopher, and he becomes intoxicated. After the repast, play is proposed. A little play with one's intimate friends is a harmless pastime. He plays and loses all that is in his purse, and 4 times as much on his word. A dispute arises on some circumstances in the game, and the disputants grow warm. One of his intimate friends throws a dice-box at his head and strikes out one of his eyes. The philosopher Memnon is carried home to his house, drunk and penniless, with the loss of an eye. He sleeps out his debauch, and when his head has got a little clear, he sends his servant to the receiver general of the finances of Nineveh to draw a little money to pay his debts of honour to his intimate friends. The servant returns and informs him that the receiver general had that morning been declared a fraudulent bankrupt, and that by this means 100 families are reduced to poverty and despair. Memnon, almost beside himself, puts a plaster on his eye and a petition in his pocket, and goes to court to solicit justice from the king against the bankrupt. Memnon hid himself in a corner and waited for the moment when he could throw himself at the feet of the monarch. That moment at last arrived. 3 times he kissed the earth and presented his petition. His gracious majesty received him very favourably, and referred the paper to one of his satraps, that he might give him an account of it. The satrap takes Memnon aside, and says to him with a haughty air and satirical grin, "Hark ye, you fellow with the one eye, you must be a comical dog indeed to address yourself to the king rather than to me, and still more so to dare to demand justice against an honest bankrupt, whom I honour with my protection, and who is nephew to the waiting maid of my mistress. Proceed no further in this business, my good friend, if you wish to preserve the eye you have left." Memnon, having thus in his closet resolved to renounce women, the excesses of the table, play and quarrelling, but especially having determined never to go to court, had been in the short space of 24 hours duped and robbed by a gentle dame, had got drunk, had gamed, had been engaged in a quarrel, had got his eye knocked out, and had been at court where he was sneered at and insulted. Well, Monsieur Voltaire leaves us in no doubt whatsoever that Memnon did not discover the key to human wisdom. And as far as we know, neither has anyone else. There'll be another story of quality this time next week. I hope you'll tune in. I'm Kim Dodsworth.